Azure Developer CLI is an open source tool that accelerates cloud application development by providing developer friendly commands and templates in order to streamline the process of building, deploying, and managing application on the Microsoft Azure platform. And that's all there is to know about the Azure Developer CLI. Bye bye. Oh, you're still here. You want to learn more about Azure Developer CLI? Perfect. Let's dive in. Hello for this session from the Azure Back to School initiative. My name is Tidjani Belmansour, and today we'll see how we can go from code to cloud with the Azure Developer CLI. My name is Tidjani Belmansour. I'm a cloud architect and the director of the Azure Center of Excellence for COFOMO, based in Quebec. I'm also an Azure MVP since 2019 and the co-host of the Azure Quebec community. You can reach to me on Twitter or LinkedIn. And you also have my blogs. The Espace Nuagique is the French version, and the Dev2 is the English version. So before we see and we take a look at Azure Developer CLI, let's see how we approach a development project. So this is a simplified version, simplified steps. Okay, so but it represents the basic steps involved in a development project. So the first step, we write code. Then we perform local testing of our application. Then we deploy to a target environment, like the staging or QA environment. We perform acceptance testing, and we perform the release of the application to the wild. Okay, so this very simplified version. When we perform local testing in an on-premise world, it's quite easy, right? Because we are either working on a Windows machine or a Linux machine that represent the target environment, the production environment. So usually, if your company is using Windows as a production environment, you will be developing on a Windows machine. And if your company is using Linux as a production environment, you will likely be using Linux for your development. Okay, so in the context, for example, of a web application, you can run it on your local IIS and ensure application is working. And because your production environment will also run on IIS, you can guess that it will work. Okay, but how do we perform local testing for a cloud project? If your target environment, your production environment is Azure, and you test your application on IIS, does that mean it's similar environment? Well, you've guessed it, not exactly. So for that matter, what can we do? We can use Azure Developer CLI. The first time I heard about Azure Developer CLI, I was wondering what the developer part represents. I was accustomed to Azure CLI, which enable us to manage, deploy, and create infrastructure on Azure. But Azure Developer CLI was kind of mystery to me. So Azure Developer CLI is a CLI that accelerates Azure project initialization. Okay, so we can go from code to cloud the right way. The target audience here, as you have guessed it, are developers. And Azure Developer CLI was first released on July 12, 2022. So it's like fairly new CLI, okay? So why do we need or do we want to use Azure Developer CLI? Well, as developers, our craft, our art is code, okay, not infrastructure. So how do we test that code in a sandbox, in a virtual environment? Okay, so we have multiple options. The first one is obviously creating our own infrastructure on Azure through maybe the Azure portal. So we can log on to the Azure portal, create resources, and so on. Okay, so even this approach works. It's not very practical. Why? Because we will have to do it again and again. And because we will have to do it again and again, it's both tedious and also error prone. Okay, so why do we have to do it again and again? The first reason is because we are starting a new project, so we have to create a new infrastructure. The second reason is even though we are in the same project, we will have to do or to recreate that infrastructure in our sandbox, because those sandboxes usually have a limited lifespan. And in fact, many organizations perform automation to delete the content of those sandboxes after a given period of time to ensure to keep cost under control. Okay. The second approach, second option, is to create that infrastructure in an automatic manner. And this is actually the recommended approach. Okay. So the IAC code, the infrastructure code, can then be reused from project to project and even during the same project in case our sandbox has been cleared and we need to recreate that infrastructure. So when we use that automatic approach, there are some considerations to take into account. The first one is how do we reuse the IAC code? And IAC, by the way, stands for infrastructure as code. Okay, so we can obviously do copy and paste of that infrastructure code across project. This works, but it's not ideal. Why? Because if we perform a modification in one version, we need to replicate that modification probably in other project too. Okay. So wouldn't it be great if we had a template that already contains that infrastructure code? The second consideration to keep in mind is how do we ensure that the infrastructure code actually follows best practices? Although anyone can write infrastructure as code script or code, we are not all experienced in infrastructure. So we perhaps won't respect best practices when it comes to IAC scripting. Okay. So wouldn't it be great if we have a template that already contains that code and that code is built with respect to best practices? And that's what Azure Developer CLI is all about. So Azure Developer CLI will provide in its templates both a sample code, a starter code for your application, so the .NET or Node or React or any other language, Java, Python, and so on, code, but also the infrastructure as code required for the resources of your application to be deployed to Azure. It also provides monitoring for your application out of the box and a YAML file for your CI CD pipelines. So Azure Developer CLI is actually a CLI, as the name stands for. So we have multiple commands. The root command is AZD, okay, so Azure Developer. And then we have many other commands to perform different tasks. We'll look at many of them in the upcoming slides. So the first thing we need to know about Azure Developer CLI is that it allows us to take our application and move from on-premises to the cloud in a seamless manner. Okay. So where do these templates come from? Well, Microsoft already provides many of them for different scenarios, but you can also create your own template. In fact, there are many third-party templates, and for all of these templates are grouped in the templates gallery. Okay, so if we go to aka.ms/awesomeazd, that's the location of the template gallery. Okay, and here you can see we have filters. Okay, we can select maybe infrastructure as code that we want in Bicep or Terraform. We can select Language, maybe I use Python, so I only want to see Python templates, okay? Or maybe I want to select topics. Maybe I'm interested in artificial intelligence with Python templates. And you can see I have, as of today, 21 templates for that. Okay. So among all of these awesome templates, there are, I'm a .NET and C Sharp guy. Okay. So I will focus on this. There are many templates for .NET and C Sharp. The most simplest one is the one you see right now. Okay, so we have an application, a three-tier application with an Azure SQL database as a data store. We have a web API written in .NET and a front end written in React. Okay, to perform security, we have a key vault that stores secrets like maybe the connection string, API keys, and so on. And we have Azure Monitor to perform monitoring of our application. So, as a developer, if I was to create all of these resources, I may need to be fluent in Azure and have a bit of great experience in Azure to design a solution like that that is both performant and secure and ensures monitoring. Okay, but thanks to Azure Developer CLI, I can create it with a single command. Okay, from the template. Okay, here you can see a most complex template. And in this template, it's what we call the reliable web application pattern. Okay, so we have a web application with a database and a Redis cache and so on that's deployed in two different regions, and the cross-region communication is ensured with an Azure front door. Okay, so there is also a template for this scenario on Azure Developer CLI template gallery. So before we explore templates, let's set up our development machine. So Azure Developer CLI is a CLI that runs on your own workstation. So you can go to aka.ms/azd-install to install the Azure Developer CLI on your own machine. So let's do this, aka.ms slash install azd. And there you can see it. We have for Windows, Linux, and Mac, and either as a container, so you don't need to install it on your own machine. Okay, so you reduce the impact on your machine. So I've already installed this on my Windows machine. So if I go in my terminal and type azd, as you can see, the Azure Developer CLI is already installed. So I could install it from there. There are links for that. Or if I'm using Windows, I can use Winget. Okay, Winget is available for Windows 10 and Windows 11, and you can see it as apt-get for Windows. Okay, for the Linux people that are hearing this session. Okay, so if I want to install it using another CLI, so Winget is a CLI. I can run winget install microsoft.azd and we'll have installed the azd CLI. If I already have the azd CLI, I can run the upgrade command to ensure that I have the latest version. And finally, if I don't want to use azd anymore on my machine, I can simply run the uninstall command to remove it from my machine. So the first thing after installing azd CLI that you need to do is to initialize a project. And you initialize the project usually with a template. Okay, so this is done with the azd init dash dash template command, providing the name of that template. So where do we find the name of the template? So let's go back to the template library. If I look for Microsoft authored, and C sharp, I can see multiple templates, currently 19, but the one we were looking at earlier is this one, the reliable uh, web application pattern. And we also have this one, the React web app with C Sharp API and SQL database. Okay, so if I click on it, it will show me this pan here, this right hand pan, and I can find here the command to initialize the project with that template. Okay, or I can go to the GitHub page to see the code of that template and to learn more about the template itself, how it works, how it was designed, and so on. Okay, so here, let's copy this command. Let's go back to our terminal. And type the command. So now AZD is downloading the template for that kind of application, and it's asking me for an environment name. What does that mean? It means because AZD will help us deploy our application to Azure, it needs to know what environment we are planning to deploy. Usually we'll name our environment like dev for development, but we can have multiple environment for maybe development, staging, and so on. Why? Because each environment will have its own environment variables with their own values. For example, the connection string to your database in an development environment variable won't be the same for the staging environment. Okay, so let's simply type dev here, and as you can see, we now have our project initialized. Okay, so let's open this in Visual Studio Code, and as you can see, we have this structure here. Okay, so we have the source code of the application here, and we have the infrastructure code for the resources of that application. Okay. Speaking about the project structure, as you see, there are many folders in that structure. So the infra folder, as the name suggests, contains the infrastructure as code for the application. This code is usually either written in Bicep or in Terraform. SRC stands for source. It's the source code. It's either .NET, Java, Python, and so on. Tests contain the automated tests, unit tests, integration tests, and so on for your application that are provided as part of this template. Asset contains images, videos, audio files, everything that's required by your application. Okay. .azdo is a folder that contains the YAML file for your Azure pipeline. So if you want to set up an Azure pipeline to deploy your application through an automated pipeline, a CI/CD pipeline, you already have the YAML file for that. The .github is the same, but for the GitHub action. So if you want to use GitHub action instead of Azure pipelines, you will find the YAML file for that in the .github folder. .dev container contains the configuration to run that application in a dev container. So you don't have to run it on your machines. For example, if you don't want to install .NET or install all the prerequisite on your machine, you can run the application in a dev container that have all of this prerequisite. The Azure folder contains the environment variable for the application. Okay, so as you can see here, we may find the connection string for our application inside, the connection string to our database like Cosmos DB, and so on. Okay, and we also have the .vs code. This folder is specifically designed for VS Code and contains VS Code configuration. It's including the required or recommended extension for VS Code in order to seamlessly work with that application. Okay. And we also have the azure.yaml file. Okay, this file is at the root of the folder structure. And this file, it's what describes the structure of the application. So if you recall from the graphic we saw earlier, our application is composed of a web API. So we find the code for that web API in under src/API folder, and that API is written in JavaScript for this example, and it will be deployed to an Azure Container App. Okay, same for the web. So um, here the web section, the web front end, is also written in JavaScript. You can expect this to be a React application, for example, and the code is found under src/web, and it will also be deployed to a container app. Okay, so this file is important because by taking a look at this file, you can understand how your application is designed and what resources will be used to host your application. So now we initialize the project, we created our code, we are ready to run our application and deploy it to Azure in order to see if it works as expected. Okay. So the first thing we need to do is to log into our Azure environment. And for that, we have a specific command. It's azd auth login. If I go here to azd auth login, so it's retrieving my subscription. Okay. And now I can do the azd provision, okay, which will provision the Azure infrastructure. So this won't deploy the application. So if I do the provision, so if I install npm, I don't have it here. I install it using Winget, and now I can start again. Is it the provision? Okay. As you can see, the provisioning has started, and the first thing is Microsoft is asking me, or actually Azure CLI is asking me on which subscription um, I want to deploy my resources. I will use my Azure sponsorship. Canada Central, it's the region I want to use. And now, as you can see, it started creating the resources. So we have the resource group already created. So the app service plan has been created. Now it's creating, updating the key vault, log analytics, and so on. So it may take some time. So let's come back when it's finished. So the next command is azd deploy, and this command will compile the code and deploy it to Azure. So it is actually expecting resources to already being created. So if no resources are created, this will fail miserably. Okay. There is another command which is azd-up that can be used to perform both the provisioning and the deployment of the application in a single operation. Most of the time you will want to use azd-up, especially the first time you are deploying the application using this template. Okay. In subsequent iteration, you will maybe want to use only azd deploy. Why? Because they speed up the process. Because even though the provisioning command won't change your infrastructure because it's already there, it will perform checks to ensure that everything is there. And if your template has a complex infrastructure, this operation may take time. Okay, so you may want to skip that operation and simply do an azd deploy. Okay, and the second reason I found out that when you have complex infrastructure and you perform an azd up, sometimes you reach a timeout because it takes too much time. So in this situation, if you have a complex infrastructure, I recommend that you perform the provisioning first and then the deployment. Okay. But for this example, the one that we are using today, we could have performed azd up and it will work. Let's see if it has finished. Not yet. As you can see, we have more resources created now. So let's keep going. So now our application is deployed. We can monitor that application using azd monitor. Okay. So let's take a break and come back when the resources are provisioned. So as you can see, the creation of this infrastructure, the provisioning of this infrastructure took about 6 minutes. Okay. So now we have the infrastructure. What we can do is we can do the azd deploy. So this will compile the code, generate publishing packages, and deploy it to our newly created infrastructure. So this may take a bit of time too. Let's take another break and come back as soon as it's completed. So now the code has been deployed. The next command we can do, the first thing before we run the next command, let's go to our Azure portal. So if I go to my Azure portal, if you recall, our resource group is named rg-dev. And by the way, dev stands for the name of the environment that we provided. Okay. And here we can see all of these resources that were deployed. Okay. So now we have our application. We can monitor that application using azd monitor. And what this command will do, it will open the Azure portal in the Azure Monitor blade. Okay. And if you see here, it has already created a dashboard for us, specifically for our application with different metrics. Okay. So here we have multiple metrics that we can monitor. Okay. And this, if we see in the resources, we can see it here. It is one of the resources that was deployed as part of the provisioning the infrastructure for the application. So it's part of the infrastructure as code that is provided with our template. Isn't that great? And finally, if we want to perform this deployment in an automatic manner rather than using the command, we can set up an AZD pipeline for that. Okay, we can later enhance our pipeline with more steps, like maybe running SonarQube, or in order to ensure that the code is secure, and so and all of this kind of stuff. Okay, so just remember that if you want to use or to create your pipeline with GitHub Action, you have a YAML file for that. And if you want to do that for Azure Pipeline, you have a YAML file for that too. So if you run this command, it will create a service principal first, that has the ability to deploy to your Azure environment, and then it will configure the pipeline. Okay, with that service principal used for the service connection. And finally, after you have completed your test and so on, you can perform the azd down command in order to delete all the Azure resources and stop being charged, or stop the billing for these resources. Okay. In case you need help with any command, you can use the contextual help with the -h option. Okay. So if I run azd-h here, as you can see, I have a lot of information. So if I run maybe azd deploy -h, I can see a contextual help specific to that command. So it explains what the deploy command is, what are different flags and options, and provide some example for that. Okay. So and that's all that I wanted to talk to you about today. So I encourage you to go and explore the Azure Developer CLI yourself. So you can install the Azure Developer CLI, you can run it, you can start with pre-existing templates. Okay, you can browse the template gallery for that. And I wish you a good exploration of the Azure Developer CLI, and enjoy the rest of the Azure Back to School sessions. And there you have it. You now know almost everything there is to know about Azure Developer CLI. The only thing that we didn't explore today is how do we create our own templates. But that is a topic for another session. Bye for now. Are you still here? I wasn't joking. Learn to build our own templates is really a matter of another session. So bye for now.